a quiet town in the American heartland. In the early 1900s, Villisca, Iowa, was the sort of town where life seemed predictable and safe. Nestled in Montgomery County, its name itself meant pretty place, and the community lived up to it. With a population of just over 2,000, Villisca was an example of small-town America at its best. Quiet streets, friendly neighbors, and hardworking families who knew one another by name. The town thrived on farming, trade, and church life. The railroad brought in business and kept Villisca connected with the wider world. Children played in dirt yards and along wooden sidewalks, while adults gathered at the church or general store. On Sundays, bells rang, calling the faithful to worship. Doors were rarely locked. Families trusted one another. But beneath this tranquility, there was something else, a vulnerability that no one noticed until it was too late. Villisca's peace was about to be shattered by one of the most brutal crimes in American history. The Moore family. At the heart of this story was the Moore family, pillars of Villisca society. Josiah B. Moore, known as Joe, was 43 years old in 1912. He was a successful businessman, well-liked and respected. He ran a thriving farm implement store and was active in the community. People admired him for his honesty and hardworking nature. Sarah Moore, his wife, was 39, a devoted mother, and deeply involved in the Presbyterian Church. She was especially active in women's and children's programs, where she was known for her warm, nurturing personality. Together, they had 4 children. Herman, 11. Catherine, 10. Boyd, 7. Paul, 5. The Moores' 2-story home at 508 East 2nd Street was modest but comfortable. White clapboard siding, a wide porch, and neatly kept rooms reflected the values of a family rooted in faith, hard work, and love. By all accounts, the Moores were a happy, close-knit family. The Stillinger sisters. On Sunday, June 9, 1912, the Moore children had invited friends to join them after church. That night, 2 guests stayed over, Inez Stillinger, 8, and her sister Lena, 12. The Stillinger girls were daughters of a farming family who lived just outside Villisca. They were well-behaved, cheerful children, known and loved by many. Their parents agreed to let them stay at the Moore home after the church program, a decision that would become one of the most tragic in Iowa history. Children's Day at the Presbyterian Church. June 9, 1912 was a special day in Villisca. The Presbyterian Church was hosting its annual Children's Day program, a celebration of youth, faith, and family. For weeks, the children had practiced songs, recitations, and skits. Parents sewed costumes, teachers coached performances, and excitement filled the air. The Moore family played an important role. Sarah helped organize the event, while all 4 Moore children took part in the program. The Stillinger sisters were also participants, adding their voices and smiles to the evening. The church was packed with families that Sunday night. The program began around 8 p.m. and continued late into the evening. Townspeople remembered it as a joyous occasion, children on stage, parents in pews, and laughter echoing through the sanctuary. It was the kind of night that reminded everyone why they loved small-town life. When the program ended, Josiah Moore gathered his family and the Stillinger sisters. They walked together from the church to their home just a few blocks away. It was nearly 10 p.m., a little later than usual for children, but the night was warm and the streets of Villisca felt safe. The walk home. Neighbors recalled seeing the group walking cheerfully through town. The children, tired but happy, clung to their parents' hands or skipped along the dusty road. The Stillinger sisters chatted excitedly, pleased to be spending the night with friends. No one suspected danger. No one could have imagined that as they made their way home, a killer was waiting. The Moore home that night. The Moore's home was simple and welcoming. Inside, kerosene lamps cast a soft glow across the wooden floors. Upstairs, bedrooms were arranged for the children, while Josiah and Sarah slept in a separate room. The Stillinger girls were given the guest room downstairs. That night the house was full of laughter as the children prepared for bed. They were still buzzing from the church program. Soon, however, exhaustion overtook them. One by one, they drifted off to sleep. By 10:30 p.m., the Moore house was silent. 8 people, 6 children and 2 adults, slept peacefully, unaware of the horror that was about to unfold. The shadow in Villisca. Somewhere in the dark streets of Villisca, a man with an axe approached the Moore home. To this day, no one knows exactly how the killer entered. Some believe he slipped in before the family returned, hiding in the attic until they slept. Others argue he came in later, through an unlocked door or window. What is certain is this: by midnight, a stranger stood inside the Moore home, watching as the family slept. In his hands, he carried an axe. The Villisca Axe Murders remain one of the most terrifying unsolved crimes in American history. But before we confront the gruesome details, we must understand the innocence that was destroyed. Villisca was a town where children played freely, where families worshiped together, and where doors were left unlocked. That fragile peace ended forever on the night of June 9, 1912, the night of June 9/10, 1912. The silent hours of midnight. The small town of Villisca lay under a blanket of darkness on the night of June 9, 1912. The streets were quiet, lit only by the faint glow of kerosene lamps in windows and the pale silver of the moon. Most residents had long since gone to bed, comforted by the belief that their town was safe. But at the Moore residence, something sinister stirred. At some point between midnight and 2:00 a.m., an intruder moved silently through the home at 508 East 2nd Street. In his hands, he carried a heavy axe, one that belonged to the Moore family. How he entered the house remains a mystery. Some believe he had hidden in the attic while the family was still at church earlier that evening, waiting patiently in the sweltering summer heat. Others suggest he slipped in through an unlocked door or window after the family had fallen asleep. Either way, by the time the town was wrapped in silence, the killer was already inside. The first blows. The killer crept upstairs first, where Josiah and Sarah Moore slept in the master bedroom. Josiah, a man known for his energy and strength, never stirred. The murderer raised the axe and brought it down with terrifying force, striking Josiah's head repeatedly. Later examination showed that he had been hit so many times that his face was unrecognizable. Sarah was next. She likely woke as the blows fell on her husband, but she had no time to scream. The killer struck her in the head, silencing her instantly. Both parents were dead within moments. The children upstairs. After killing the parents, the murderer turned his attention to the children. Herman, 11. Catherine, 10. Boyd, 7. Paul, 5. One by one, the axe fell on each child as they slept. The strikes were swift and brutal, crushing their skulls. None of them are believed to have woken in time to resist. The sheer violence shocked investigators later. The children's small frames were left broken and bloodied, their lives stolen in silence. The Stillinger sisters. The killer then descended to the first floor, where the Stillinger sisters, Ina, 8, and Lena, 12, slept in the guest bedroom. Evidence later suggested that Lena may have woken during the attack. Unlike the others, she was found in a position that implied movement. Her body lay sideways on the bed, and her nightgown was pulled up, leading investigators to suspect she may have been assaulted. However, no conclusive evidence of sexual assault was ever proven. What is certain is that Lena, like her sister, was bludgeoned to death with the same axe. By the time the night ended, 8 innocent people lay dead. The killer's strange rituals. What made the Villisca Axe Murders even more disturbing were the strange, ritualistic behaviors the killer carried out after the murders. Covering the faces, the murderer draped sheets or clothing over the faces of his victims, as if unwilling to look at them after the killings. Even the mirrors in the home were covered with claws. Food left untouched on the kitchen table. Investigators later found a plate of food and a bowl of bloody water. It appeared the killer had made himself a meal but never ate it, washing his hands instead. Deliberate destruction. Josiah Moore's wounds were far more extensive than the others. The killer had struck him dozens of times with the blade of the axe, almost as if rage or vengeance was directed specifically at him. These odd details fueled endless theories. Was it personal hatred, religious symbolism, or simply the work of a deranged mind? Morning comes. The morning of June 10, 1912, began like any other in Villisca. Neighbors went about their chores, children prepared for school, and the town stirred with normal life. But at the Moore residence, something was wrong. By 7:30 a.m., Mary Peckham, the Moore's next-door neighbor, noticed unusual silence. The Moore family was normally up early, tending to chores and farm duties, but the house remained still. Concerned, Mary approached the house and knocked on the door. No answer. She tried opening the door but found it locked. Mary let the chickens out of their coop and continued waiting, but unease gnawed at her. By 8:00 a.m., she called Ross Moore, Josiah's brother. The grim discovery. Ross arrived around 8:30. He used his own key to enter the home. What greeted him was a scene of unimaginable horror. Walking through the house, Ross first encountered the bodies of the Stillinger sisters in the downstairs bedroom. Terrified, he immediately called for help. Local law enforcement was summoned, and soon the house was swarming with townspeople. Unfortunately, Villisca's sense of trust and naivety led to one of the greatest mistakes in the investigation. Curious neighbors and townsfolk wandered through the crime scene. By the time investigators could secure the house, dozens of people had walked through, touching objects, moving evidence, and leaving the scene contaminated. Some even took fragments of Josiah's skull as morbid souvenirs. Law enforcement's horror. Sheriff Hank Horton was among the first officers to fully examine the scene. His description was grim. All 8 victims had been killed in their sleep. The axe was found inside the house, leaning against a wall, smeared with blood. Curtains were drawn, mirrors covered, and clothing draped over faces. The blood-soaked room smelled of iron and death, a heavy silence hanging over them. The sheriff quickly realized the magnitude of what had happened. This was the largest mass murder in Iowa's history. Panic in Villisca. News of the killing spread like wildfire. By mid-morning, the once peaceful town was in chaos. Parents kept children indoors, farmers abandoned fields to gather in town, and churches filled with praying families. Rumors swirled. Some whispered that a deranged tramp had done it. Others suspected a local enemy of Josiah Moore. Still others claimed it was the work of a serial killer passing through. Fear gripped the town. Doors that had never been locked before were suddenly bolted shut. Farmers armed themselves. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. The town of trust had been transformed overnight into a place of dread. The funeral. The joint funeral for the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters was held on June 12, 1912, at Villisca's town square. Thousands attended, many weeping openly. The small coffins lined in a row were a heartbreaking sight, a stark reminder of innocence destroyed. The Moores and Stillinger sisters were buried in quiet cemeteries nearby, but their deaths would forever haunt Villisca. The night of June 9-10, 1912 was unlike anything the people of Villisca or America had ever seen. 8 people were slaughtered in their sleep, and the killer vanished without a trace. The investigation and suspects. The challenge of 1912 policing. The Villisca Axe Murders shocked not just the town but the entire state of Iowa. Yet, law enforcement faced monumental challenges. It was 1912, decades before fingerprint databases, DNA testing, or modern forensic science. Investigators relied largely on witness statements, circumstantial evidence, and intuition. To make matters worse, the crime scene had been severely compromised. Hundreds of townspeople had wandered through the Moore house before it was properly secured. Critical evidence was trampled, moved, or even stolen. The sheriff admitted later that the investigation was nearly impossible because of the contamination. Despite these obstacles, authorities launched one of the most intense manhunts in Iowa's history. Early theories. Almost immediately, several theories emerged about who might have been behind the massacre. A local enemy of Josiah Moore. Josiah was a successful businessman who had once worked for Frank Jones, a powerful state senator and owner of a large store in Villisca. Josiah left Jones's store to open his own business, taking customers, and allegedly humiliating his former employer. Rumors swirled that bitter resentment grew between them. Some believed the murders were an act of revenge, possibly carried out by a hired killer. A traveling stranger or tramp. Others speculated that the crime was committed by a transient passing through town. The railroad ran near Villisca, and hobos often camped in the area. The brutality and randomness of the attack led many to believe it was the work of a deranged outsider. Religious or ritualistic motive. The strange details, covered faces, covered mirrors, and untouched food led some to think the killings had symbolic meaning. Was it the work of a religious fanatic or cult member? The work of a serial killer. Within weeks, investigators began to notice similarities between the Villisca murders and other axe killings across the Midwest. This raised the chilling possibility that a serial killer was traveling from town to town, striking families at night. Frank Jones and the political rivalry. One of the first serious suspects was Frank F. Jones, the wealthy businessman and politician. Josiah Moore had once been employed by Jones's store. Moore later opened his own business, which flourished, taking business away from Jones. Rumors also circulated that Moore was having an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law, though this was never proven. Many in Villisca believed Jones had both the motive and the means to arrange the killings. However, there was never direct evidence tying him to the murders. Still, whispers of his involvement lingered for years. The mysterious stranger, Reverend George Kelly. Perhaps the most bizarre suspect was Reverend George Kelly, an English-born preacher with a reputation for odd behavior. He had been in Villisca the night of the murders, attending the same Children's Day service as the Moore family. Witnesses claimed he left town early the next morning, unusually nervous. He was known for being unstable, with a history of sexual deviance and mental illness. In 1917, 5 years after the murders, Kelly was arrested and charged. Investigators claimed he had sent strange letters about the case and even confessed during an interrogation. However, his confession was inconsistent, and many believed it was coerced. After 2 trials, Kelly was acquitted. Still to this day, some believe Reverend Kelly was the killer. The theory of a serial killer. One of the most chilling aspects of the Villisca murders is how closely they resemble other axe killings in the region during the same era. In Colorado Springs, 1911, an entire family was killed with an axe. In Ellsworth, Kansas, 1911, a family was murdered in a similar fashion. In Paola, Kansas, 1912, just weeks before Villisca, another family was slaughtered in their beds. In all cases, victims were killed at night. An axe was the weapon. Mirrors or windows were covered. The killer vanished without a trace. This led investigators to suspect a traveling murderer, possibly using the railroad to move between towns. Some even linked these killings to the infamous Axe Man of New Orleans years later. The Bloodhound Search. Within days of the murders, investigators brought in bloodhounds from Beatrice, Nebraska. The dogs picked up a scent and followed it from the Moore house to the edge of town, where it disappeared along the railroad tracks. This seemed to confirm the theory of a killer fleeing by train. Yet, no further evidence was ever found. False confessions and dead ends. As the case dragged on, desperation grew. Over the years, several people came forward claiming responsibility for the murders. Most were quickly dismissed as attention seekers or mentally unstable individuals. The lack of physical evidence left the case at a standstill. Newspapers sensationalized every rumor, and townspeople turned against each other in suspicion. The psychological impact. The investigation wasn't just about suspects. It was about the atmosphere it created in Villisca. Families began sleeping with weapons beside their beds. Doors were locked at night, something almost unheard of before. People became suspicious of strangers, drifters, and even neighbors. The once peaceful farming community was forever changed. Fear lingered like a shadow long after the blood had dried. Legacy of the investigation. Despite the efforts of local sheriffs, state investigators, and even private detectives, no one was ever convicted. Frank Jones remained a figure of suspicion, but was never arrested. Reverend George Kelly's trial ended in acquittal. The serial killer theory was compelling but unprovable. The case officially went cold, joining the ranks of America's greatest unsolved crimes, trials, public obsession, and the national spectacle. The case captures America. By the summer of 1912, the Villisca murders were no longer just a small-town tragedy. They had become a national obsession. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco ran lurid headlines about the axe fiend of Villisca. Editorials speculated wildly about the killer's identity, turning the case into both a mystery and a macabre form of entertainment. For a nation entering the modern era, the murders clashed violently with America's image of progress. The brutality seemed medieval, a reminder that even in peaceful farm communities, horror could strike without warning. Reverend George Kelly's strange obsession. Among the names that surfaced again and again was Reverend George Kelly, the eccentric English-born preacher. Kelly had attended the Children's Day program, the Moore family took part in on the evening before the murders. Witnesses said he was fixated on the young girls in the church performance. He left Villisca abruptly the next morning, boarding a train east. In the months that followed, Kelly sent disturbing letters to investigators and even to relatives of the victims. Some contained bizarre religious ramblings. Others hinted that he had knowledge of the crime. By 1917, 5 years after the murders, authorities finally arrested Kelly. They believed they had their man. Kelly's confession. The preacher's interrogation produced what investigators thought was a breakthrough. Kelly confessed. He described details of the Moore house. He claimed that God's voice had commanded him to slay utterly. He admitted to swinging the axe until they were no more. Yet there were problems. Kelly's mental health was fragile. He was known to be delusional, and his confession shifted every time he retold it. Sometimes he claimed he killed all 8 victims. Other times he insisted he only killed 1 or 2. Despite inconsistencies, prosecutors believed they had enough for trial. The first trial. The first trial of George Kelly took place in 1917. The courtroom was packed with journalists and curious onlookers. For many in Villisca, this was the moment they had waited 5 years for. The prosecution painted Kelly as a dangerous, unstable man who had given in to violent impulses. They leaned heavily on his confession, despite its contradictions. The defense countered by attacking the reliability of that confession. They argued it had been coerced during hours of grueling questioning. They reminded the jury that there was no physical evidence linking Kelly to the crime. The jury deadlocked, unable to agree on a verdict. The second trial. A second trial was scheduled soon after. Once again, the small town filled with reporters and spectators. Once again, Reverend Kelly took the stand, rambling about visions and divine orders. But this time, the defense's argument struck deeper. Jurors were persuaded that Kelly's confession was the product of a disturbed mind, not proof of guilt. In the end, Kelly was acquitted. With his release, the case collapsed. Authorities had no other strong suspects to bring to trial. Frank Jones and the Whisper Campaign. Even while Kelly stood trial, another name remained in the background. Frank F. Jones, the wealthy politician and businessman. Whispers persisted that Jones had hired someone to kill Josiah Moore out of revenge. Jones, however, was never formally charged. His influence and wealth made him difficult to pursue. That didn't stop newspapers from speculating. Some ran stories hinting at conspiracies. Others openly accused Jones of orchestrating the crime. For years, his reputation was shadowed by suspicion, though nothing was ever proven. Public obsession with the crime. The Villisca murders tapped into America's growing fascination with crime stories. The early 1900s were a period when sensational journalism, often called yellow journalism, thrived. Newspapers exaggerated details. Rumors were printed as fact. Reporters dug into the private lives of suspects and victims alike. Readers couldn't get enough. In a time before television or radio dramas, true crime stories filled the public's appetite for both fear and intrigue. The Moore family's tragedy was retold countless times in print, each retelling more dramatic than the last. The role of fear in small-town America. Beyond headlines, the murders changed daily life in Villisca and similar towns across the Midwest. Families began locking their doors at night, something previously uncommon in rural Iowa. Neighbors grew suspicious of one another. Parents kept a closer eye on their children. In effect, Villisca became a symbol of vulnerability. If horror could strike in such a quiet farming community, it could strike anywhere. Theories of a serial killer. As reporters connected dots between the Villisca murders and other axe killings across the Midwest, a new theory emerged. The killer wasn't a Villisca local at all, but a roving serial murderer. Cases in Kansas, Colorado, and Illinois all bore striking similarities. Families slain in their sleep, axes used, mirrors covered, food left behind. Some investigators suggested the Villisca killer was part of a string of axe murders stretching across state lines, possibly riding the railroads to commit crimes in different towns. This theory gained traction because it explained why no one in Villisca could be definitively tied to the murders. But without modern forensics, it remained speculative. The media circus. The longer the case dragged on without resolution, the more it transformed into spectacle. Journalists clashed over theories. Amateur sleuths wrote letters to editors with their own solutions. Preachers used the murders as sermon material, warning of sin and divine punishment. Villisca itself became a kind of grim tourist attraction. Visitors traveled from other states just to see the murder house. Some were curious. Others wanted to experience the thrill of standing where the crime took place. For the townspeople, this attention was both invasive and insulting. What had been an unspeakable tragedy became fodder for gossip and sensationalism. The case goes cold. By the 1920s, momentum in the case slowed. Reverend Kelly was free, Frank Jones untouchable, and the serial killer idea unprovable. The investigation, though never officially closed, dwindled into silence. Yet the murders never left the public imagination. They were recounted in true crime magazines, books, and eventually documentaries. Each retelling added layers of myth, making it difficult to separate fact from folklore. Aftermath, lingering fear and theories that wouldn't die. The collapse of justice. When Reverend George Kelly was acquitted in 1917, the sense of disappointment across Iowa was profound. For 5 years, Residents had clung to the hope that the eccentric preacher's trial would bring closure. Instead, the acquittal left Villisca where it had been all along, a town with 8 dead and no justice. The sheriff's department, exhausted and embarrassed, admitted that the case had gone cold. Officially, investigators still looked at leads, but privately, many admitted that too much time had passed and too much evidence had been lost. The Moore family's relatives, along with the Stillingers' parents, were left in despair. For them, the acquittal was not just a legal failure, it was a betrayal. The shadow over Villisca. The murders cast a long, dark shadow over the town. Villisca had once been a thriving farming community, proud of its church, businesses, and social life. After 1912, however, the name Villisca became synonymous with horror. Outsiders came to see the town as cursed. Residents grew weary of constant association with the killings. For decades, children in nearby towns whispered ghost stories about Villisca, warning each other never to walk its streets after dark. The Moore house itself, once filled with laughter, became a symbol of dread. Families who moved in often reported strange noises, cold spots, or feelings of being watched. Some locals swore the house was haunted. Others avoided the property altogether. Alternative suspects. Even after Reverend Kelly's acquittal, theories about the real killer flourished. Frank Jones and the hired killer. Many believed the powerful politician and businessman had arranged the murder of Josiah Moore to settle old scores. The theory was simple. Jones hired a professional killer, possibly William Mansfield, a man with a violent history. Mansfield himself was briefly investigated in connection with other axe murders. Some detectives claimed they had proof he was in Iowa at the time, but prosecutors lacked the hard evidence to bring charges. The drifter theory. Others held firm to the belief that the murders were committed by a transient who hopped off a passing train. This would explain the lack of local suspicion and the bloodhounds' trail ending at the railroad. The idea of a madman drifting across America, killing families at random, was both terrifying and strangely convincing. The serial killer connection. Detectives and journalists connected the Villisca murders to at least a dozen other axe murders between 1911 and 1914. These included the Colorado Springs murders, the Paula killings, and cases in Kansas and Illinois. Some suggested that Villisca's murderer was part of a wave of serial killings that had gone largely unnoticed because law enforcement was so localized. Reverend Kelly again. Despite his acquittal, Kelly remained a suspect in the public mind. His strange behavior, obsession with the case, and confession, even if retracted, kept him in the shadow of suspicion for life. He eventually faded from public view, but his name was never fully cleared. Theories beyond logic. Some theories strayed far from reason, fueled more by folklore than fact. Satanic ritual. Because the victims' faces were covered and mirrors draped, some speculated the crime had occult meaning. Personal revenge. Others suggested one of the victims had secret enemies unknown to investigators, and the killings were a revenge plot. Multiple killers. A few theorists argued that the crime was too brutal for one man to commit alone, suggesting that 2 attackers worked together. These theories, though far-fetched, thrived in the absence of solid answers. The families left behind. For the Moore and Stillinger families, the years following the murders were filled with grief and endless questions. Sarah's family mourned the loss of a daughter and grandchildren. The Stillingers, who had sent their daughters Lena and Ine to stay overnight with the Moores, were tormented by guilt, replaying the decision again and again. The tragedy fractured these families in ways outsiders couldn't see. While newspapers sensationalized the killings, the relatives quietly bore a lifetime of sorrow. The town's transformation. Villisca never truly recovered. Businesses closed as outsiders avoided the town. Farmers moved away. By the 1920s, Villisca's population was shrinking. Some locals blamed the relentless press coverage, which kept the town's darkest moment alive year after year. Others believed the stigma of unsolved mass murder simply made Villisca undesirable. It wasn't until decades later, when the Moore house became a point of historical interest, that the town began to cautiously reclaim its story. The broader impact. The Villisca case also had ripple effects across law enforcement in the Midwest. It highlighted the dangers of unsecured crime scenes, a lesson often cited in police training for years afterward. It fueled interest in the idea of criminal profiling, as investigators tried to piece together the psychology of a killer who struck in such a brutal, intimate way. It served as a warning of how easily small-town justice could be overwhelmed by media frenzy, political pressure, and lack of resources. Though it brought no closure, the case became a textbook example of investigative failure and the tragic cost of it. The case in memory. By the 1930s and 1940s, the Villisca murders had faded from daily headlines but remained alive in regional memory. True crime magazines republished the story, often exaggerating the details. Ghost stories about the Moore house circulated among children, keeping the fear alive long after the blood had dried. For the surviving relatives, however, the murders were not folklore. They were a wound that never healed. The absence of justice made the pain even sharper: legacy, hauntings, and the mystery that never dies. The house that wouldn't stay quiet. By the mid-20th century, the Moore home at 508 East 2nd Street had long since passed through many owners. Families came and went, but almost none stayed for long. Stories circulated. Children heard footsteps in empty rooms. Cold drafts swept through hallways despite sealed windows. Whispered voices were reported at night, often calling names no one recognized. Pets refused to enter certain rooms, growling at unseen presences. Though some dismissed the tales as superstition, others insisted the Moore house was haunted, trapped in time, forever echoing the screams of 1912. By the 1990s, the house had become a curiosity. When it was restored to its 1912 condition and opened for tour, it quickly drew attention from ghost hunters and true crime enthusiasts alike. A destination of darkness. Today, the Villisca Axe Murder House is one of the most infamous haunted houses in America. Visitors can tour the property during the day or even pay to spend the night inside. Countless paranormal investigators have filmed inside the home, often claiming to capture EVP recordings, electronic voice phenomena of children crying, shadow figures moving in the hallways, unexplained bangs in the attic where the killer may have waited, physical sensations like scratches or sudden headaches. For skeptics, the allure lies not in ghosts but in the raw, unfiltered history of the crime scene. The house is almost exactly as it was that night in 1912. No running water, no electricity, just a silent shell filled with unanswered questions. Pop culture fascination. The Villisca murders have inspired documentary, books, and films. Documentaries like Villisca, Living with a Mystery, 2004, explored both the crime and its impact on the community. Paranormal TV shows, from ghost adventures to most terrifying places in America, have featured the house. Horror films have borrowed elements of the story, using it as a backdrop for fictionalized terror. In true crime communities online, Villisca is often ranked alongside the Lizzie Borden case, the Axeman of New Orleans, and the Zodiac killings as one of America's most infamous unsolved mysteries. Why the case endures. More than a century later, the Villisca Axe murders remain a touchstone of mystery. But why? The brutality. 8 people, including 6 children, were slaughtered in their sleep. The sheer savagery of the crime still shocks modern audiences. The whodunit. Unlike other historic murders, no one was ever convicted. This keeps speculation alive. Every new theory feels possible because the truth was never found. The small-town innocence. Villisca was a quiet, trusting community. The murders shattered the idea that rural America was safe and untouched by evil. The haunting aspect. Whether one believes in ghosts or not, the idea that the house is haunted keeps the story in the public eye. The human element. Beyond theories and ghost hunts, at the heart of Villisca is a family, a mother, father, children, and friends, whose lives were cut short. Remembering them is part of why the case matters. The case in the digital age. The internet gave the Villisca murders a new life. On YouTube, TikTok, and podcasts, creators retell the case in chilling detail. Ghost hunters livestream from the Moore house, while true crime fans debate theories on forums. Some creators focus on the paranormal. Others dig through trial records, arguing over suspects like Reverend Kelly or William Mansfield. The effect has been to transform a 1912 crime into a modern legend, a story that evolves with each retelling. The Villisca effect. In the field of criminology and law enforcement history, the Villisca murders are sometimes referenced as part of a broader study of early 20th century unsolved crimes. They highlight how small-town police lacked resources to handle mass murders. Evidence protocols were non-existent. Political influence could warp investigations. Media pressure often did more harm than good. Modern detectives sometimes use the Villisca case as a what not to do example when teaching forensic investigation. The unanswered questions. To this day, the biggest mysteries remain. Where did the killer come from? Did he ride the rails into town, or was he someone everyone knew? Why were the mirrors covered? Was it ritual, guilt, or simply madness? How did no one hear? With 8 people killed, how did the house remain so quiet? Why Villisca? Was it random, or was there a deeper grudge against Josiah Moore? Each question fuels endless debate. With so much evidence lost to time, the answers may never come. A legacy of fear and memory. For the people of Villisca, the murders are not just a ghost story, they are history. Every year, memorial services remember the Moore family and the Stillinger girls. Their names are carved into gravestones, not just whispered in legend. The town has learned to live with its identity. What was once a source of shame has, in a way, become part of its survival. Visitors come to Villisca not just for thrills, but to honor the memory of those who died and to stand inside history itself. Why it still matters. At its core, the Villisca Axe murders endure not because of the gore, or the haunting, or the speculation, but because the case forces us to face uncomfortable truths. Evil is not confined to big cities. Safety can vanish in a single night. Justice is not guaranteed, even in the most horrific cases. It is this chilling reality that keeps people returning to Villisca, whether physically, through tour of the house, or imaginatively, through stories retold in whispers late at night.